Sometimes a man must lose everything he thought he wanted to discover what he truly needs. There comes a moment when all the gold in the world feels empty, and the soul cries out for something real. Torvald Sigurdsson was the richest Viking lord in the northern fjords, but his heart had grown cold among the endless feasts and hollow promises of noble life. When a simple letter arrived from Runa, a widow farmer in the lowlands, her honest words about land and hard work stirred something he'd forgotten. He left his wealth behind and traveled to her remote farm, expecting a grateful woman who would appreciate his sacrifice. Instead, he found someone who looked at his soft hands with disapproval and pointed him toward the barn. She told him he'd sleep there until he proved he was more than decorated pride. What happened next would change everything he thought he knew about strength and honor. But could a spoiled lord ever earn the respect of a woman who had survived completely on her own? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like old memories, wrapping around the great hall of Sigurdsson where Torvald had awakened for the last time among silken furs and golden chalices. The longhouse stretched before him in all its carved magnificence, dragon heads leering from support beams, tapestries depicting his grandfather's victories in distant lands, and tables that could seat 100 warriors. Yet as he stood in his sleeping chamber, fingering the golden arm-ring that marked his noble birth, the splendor felt as cold as the stone beneath his feet. He had dreamed again of the letter. 3 moons had passed since Runa's words had arrived, written in careful script on rough parchment that smelled of wood smoke and honest labor. "I seek not love letters or sweet promises," she had written. "I seek a man who understands that land needs tending, animals need feeding, and winter comes whether you're ready or not. If you think marriage means a warm bed and cooked meals, look elsewhere. If you understand it means shared burdens and earned respect, then perhaps we might find something worthwhile together." Those words had haunted him through countless feasts where lords boasted of conquests they'd never made and ladies simpered behind jeweled hands. The golden arm-ring felt heavier each day, a beautiful shackle binding him to a life that demanded everything and offered nothing real in return. "Torvald." His father's voice boomed through the hall. "The Jarls are gathering. Astrid's father wishes to discuss the wedding arrangements. Astrid Eriksdottir, golden-haired, properly bred, and as empty as a drinking horn after a long feast. She would bear him sons, manage his household, and never challenge a single word he spoke. The perfect noble wife, as hollow as the life she represented. He descended the carved stairs, each step echoing in the vast space. The great hearth dominated the center of the hall, its flames casting dancing shadows on the assembled faces. His father, Sigurd the Bold, sat in the high seat wearing his finest robes and the expression of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. Around him clustered the lesser jarls and their wives, all watching Torvald with expectant eyes. "Ah, my son," Sigurd declared, raising his horn of mead. "Come sit. We have much to discuss about your future." But Torvald's future lay elsewhere, in a letter folded carefully in his traveling pouch. While the nobles debated dowries and wedding dates, his mind wandered to wind-swept fields and a woman who valued calloused hands over golden rings. 2 days later, he stood at the edge of everything he'd ever known. The lowlands stretched before him, a patchwork of small farms and modest homesteads that seemed to exist in a different world from the grand fjords behind him. His horse, a fine stallion worth more than most farmers earned in a year, picked its way carefully down the muddy path toward Runa's holding. The farm appeared gradually through the morning haze, a simple wooden house with a sod roof, a barn that had seen better seasons, and fields that spoke of hard work and careful tending. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line, and he could hear the lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the house. It was nothing like the grand estates of his father's allies, yet something about its honest simplicity stirred his chest. A figure emerged from the barn, and Torvald's breath caught. Runa stood in the doorway, hay clinging to her rough-woven dress, her dark hair bound back with practical efficiency. She was not beautiful in the way of court ladies, no painted lips or silk gowns, but there was something in her bearing that commanded attention. She moved with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth and needed no man's approval to prove it. Beside her stood a boy of perhaps 14 summers, lean and sun-darkened, who watched Torvald's approach with undisguised suspicion. This would be Magnus, her son, the child she'd raised alone since his father's death. "So," Runa called out as Torvald dismounted, "you're the lord who thinks farming is simple enough for soft hands and noble intentions." Her voice carried no deference, no attempt to charm or please. She looked him up and down, taking in his fine cloak, his unmarked hands, his carefully groomed beard, and her expression suggested she found him wanting. "I am Torvald Sigurdsson," he said, offering what he hoped was his most winning smile. "I've come to answer your letter." "I can see that." She wiped her hands on a rough cloth, never taking her eyes from his face. "The question is whether you've come to work or to play at being a farmer until reality sends you running back to your golden halls." Magnus stepped forward, his young face hard with protective anger. "We don't need charity from nobles who think they can buy their way into our lives." "Magnus," Runa's voice held quiet authority, "mind your tongue, but speak your thoughts." The boy's jaw worked for a moment before he burst out, "He's too soft. Look at him. He's never done a day's real work in his life. What happens when winter comes and the work gets hard? What happens when his noble friends come calling and remind him what he's given up?" Torvald felt heat rise in his cheeks, but before he could respond, Runa nodded slowly. "Fair questions," she said. "Well, Lord, how do you answer my son's concerns?" This was not how he'd imagined this meeting. In his mind, Runa would have been grateful, perhaps even awed by his sacrifice. Instead, she stood before him like a jarl examining a questionable trade agreement, weighing his worth with eyes that had seen too much hardship to be impressed by surface appearances. "I've left my father's house permanently," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I've brought no servants, no retinue. I seek an honest life, not an easy one." Runa's laugh was short and sharp. "Seeking and achieving are different things entirely. Magnus, show him where he'll be sleeping." The boy's grin was not entirely pleasant. "The barn's got fresh straw, and there's a blanket that's only a little moth-eaten." "The barn?" Torvald couldn't hide his surprise. "You think you're sharing my bed before you've proven you're worth the space you take up?" Runa's eyebrows rose. "I've been managing alone for 2 years, Lord. I don't need a husband. I need a partner. Partners earn their place." As Magnus led him to the barn, Torvald caught sight of an older man working in the adjacent field. The stranger straightened from his labors and called out, "That's the noble, then." "Aye," Magnus replied loudly enough for all to hear. "Mother says he's going to learn farming." The older man's laughter carried across the field like the cawing of crows. "Well, that should be entertaining. I'm old Bjorn, boy. Been farming these lands for 60 summers. I'll be watching to see how long you last." That evening, as Torvald sat on his blanket in the hay-scented darkness, he could hear the family's voices through the thin wall that separated the barn from the house. Runa was teaching Magnus his letters by firelight, her voice patient and warm, so different from the sharp edge she'd shown Torvald. "Why did you really answer the letter?" Magnus asked her. "We were managing fine on our own." There was a long pause before Runa replied, "Because managing isn't the same as thriving, my son. And because even the strongest ox works better when it's not pulling the plough alone. But why him? Why a noble who's never done real work?" Another pause. "Because his letter didn't boast or promise pretty words. He asked honest questions about the work involved, about what I would expect from a husband. That showed sense, even if his hands are soft. His hands won't stay soft long if he truly means to stay," Magnus said with the practical wisdom of a boy who'd grown up too fast. "No," Runa agreed quietly, "they won't. The question is whether he has the spine to let them get hard." Torvald touched his smooth palms in the darkness, thinking of his father's calloused hands, earned in battle, not labor. Tomorrow would bring his first real test, and despite his noble confidence, Uncertainty gnawed at his stomach like hunger. Through the wall, he heard Runa banking the fire for the night, heard the quiet sounds of a household settling into sleep. This family had a rhythm, a purpose that felt more solid than all the gold in his father's treasury. He had chosen this path, burned bridges he could never rebuild. Now came the hardest part, proving he belonged here. The golden arm ring lay beside him in the straw, catching the faint moonlight that filtered through the barn's gaps. Tomorrow, he would learn whether noble blood could flow through a farmer's hands, whether the man who had everything could become worthy of the woman who needed nothing from him but honest work. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields that would either make him or break him. The choice was no longer his. It belonged to the land, the seasons, and the woman who would judge him not by his birthright, but by his willingness to earn his place in her carefully built world. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of blistered hands and a woman's grudging respect, of a boy's acceptance and the strange peace that comes from finally being where you belong. Dawn broke grey and unforgiving over the farm, and with it came Torvald's first true test. He woke to the sound of Runa moving about the farmyard, her boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. The barn was cold enough that his breath misted, and his fine woolen cloak had proven poor protection against the autumn chill that seeped through every gap in the wooden walls. Magnus appeared in the doorway, carrying a wooden bucket and wearing an expression of barely concealed amusement. "Mother says you're to start with the simplest tasks. Think you can manage milking the cows without them trampling you?" Torvald rose stiffly from his bed of straw, brushing hay from his clothes. "How difficult can it be?" "I've seen it done." The boy's grin widened. "Seeing and doing are different things, Lord. But you'll learn that soon enough. The cow's shed was warm with animal heat and thick with the smell of hay and manure. 3 brown cows stood in their stalls, chewing contentedly and eyeing Torvald with what seemed like suspicious intelligence. Magnus set down his bucket and gestured to the nearest animal. "This is Brunhilde. She's the gentlest, but she doesn't suffer fools. Sit on the stool, get the bucket positioned, and squeeze steady. Don't pull, that'll make her kick. And whatever you do, don't let go sudden-like, or she'll know you're afraid." Torvald approached the cow with what he hoped was confidence. He'd commanded men in battle, negotiated treaties with rival jarls, managed his father's vast holdings. Surely he could handle one farm animal. Brunhilde shifted her weight as he sat beside her, and Torvald reached for her udder with hands that had never touched anything rougher than sword hilts and parchment. The cow's hide was warm and surprisingly soft, but the moment he attempted to squeeze, everything went wrong. His grip was too tentative, then too harsh. Brunhilde lowed in displeasure and shifted away from him. When he tried to adjust his position, his foot caught the bucket, sending it clattering across the shed floor. The noise startled all 3 cows, and Brunhilde expressed her irritation by stepping sideways, directly onto Torvald's foot. Pain shot through his toes, trapped under the substantial weight of an annoyed cow. He yelped and tried to pull free, which only made Brunhilde shift more, grinding down harder. In desperation, he pushed against her flank, which earned him a swift kick that sent him tumbling backward into a pile of soiled straw. Magnus's laughter rang through the shed as Torvald struggled to his feet, covered in muck and nursing his bruised foot. "Well," the boy called out, "that's one way to introduce yourself to the livestock." Runa appeared in the doorway, taking in the overturned bucket, the agitated cows, and Torvald's filthy condition with a single glance. Her expression revealed nothing, but something in her stillness spoke louder than words. "I see you've met Brunhilde," she said calmly. "She's usually quite gentle with people who know what they're doing." Heat flooded Torvald's face. "It's my first attempt. I'll improve with practice. Practice won't help if you don't understand the principles." Runa stepped past him and settled onto the milking stool with fluid grace. Her hands moved with sure confidence, and within moments milk was streaming into the bucket in steady white streams. Animals respond to certainty. They sense fear, hesitation, false confidence. You can't lie to them the way you might to people. She finished with Brunhilde and moved to the next cow without missing a beat. "Magnus, show him how to muck out the stalls." That's work even nobles should be able to manage. The next 2 hours brought a parade of small disasters. Torvald's soft hands blistered within the first half hour of wielding the muckrake. His back, accustomed to sitting in cushioned chairs and riding fine horses, protested every bend and lift. The work that Magnus accomplished with easy efficiency left Torvald sweating and aching. When old Bjorn arrived to help with the heavier chores, he took one look at Torvald's efforts and shook his grizzled head. Boy's got the right idea, but he's fighting the work instead of flowing with it. Look at how he holds that rake, death grip, like it's going to run away from him. He'll learn, Runa said. But her tone suggested she had doubts. The real disaster came when she set him to repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by wind. The task seemed simple enough. Replace a few boards, hammer in some nails. How much skill could that require? Torvald had never worked with his hands beyond the ceremonial crafting expected of noble boys. His hammer blows were either too weak to drive the nails properly or so forceful that he bent them beyond use. The boards he cut were either too short or split along the grain. When he finally managed to attach one plank successfully, it hung crooked and loose. Magnus watched his struggles with growing impatience. "You're wasting good wood," the boy finally burst out. "Mother, he's going to use up half our winter supplies before he gets one board right." "Enough!" Runa's voice cut through the boy's complaints. She approached Torvald's handiwork and tested the loose board with one hand. It wobbled alarmingly. This wouldn't hold back a determined chicken, much less protect the livestock from wolves. Old Bjorn joined them, examining the fence with professional interest. "Aye, that's truth. And winter's coming fast. No time for learning on the job when wolves get hungry." The old farmer turned to study Torvald with eyes that had seen 60 winters. "Question is, Lord, what do you plan to do about it? Because this family can't afford charity work, and the land won't wait for you to figure things out." That evening, as they gathered around Runa's simple wooden table for the evening meal, the weight of failure sat heavy in Torvald's chest. His hands were raw with fresh blisters, his back ached from unfamiliar labor, and he'd accomplished less in one day than Magnus could manage in an hour. Runa served a simple stew of vegetables and barley seasoned with herbs from her garden. The food was plain but nourishing, a sharp contrast to the elaborate feasts of his father's hall. Magnus ate in sullen silence, shooting occasional glances at Torvald that mixed pity with frustration. "We need to talk," Runa said finally, setting down her wooden spoon. "About what you're really doing here." Torvald met her gaze across the table. "I'm learning to be a farmer." "No," she replied quietly. "You're playing at being a farmer. There's a difference." She rose and moved to a wooden chest near the hearth, withdrawing a collection of well-worn tools, Eric's farming implements. A hoe with a handle polished smooth by years of use, a scythe that gleamed despite its age, a hammer whose head showed the dings and scrapes of countless repairs. "These belong to my husband," she said, setting them on the table between them. "He earned every mark on them through seasons of honest work. When he died, Magnus and I kept the farm running, using what these tools taught us about dedication and skill." She picked up the hammer, its weight familiar in her calloused hands. "This isn't about whether you can learn to use tools, Torvald. It's about whether you understand what they represent. Commitment, persistence, the willingness to let the work change you instead of expecting it to bend to your will." Magnus looked up from his bowl, his young face serious. "Father said tools don't make the craftsman. They just show what kind of craftsman you already are." Runa nodded at her son's words. "So here are my terms, clearly spoken. You'll work here for a full turning of the seasons, spring planting through winter's end. If by then you've proven you can carry your weight, that this isn't just a noble's whim that'll fade when reality gets uncomfortable, then we'll talk about marriage. Real marriage. Not some arrangement where I get a useless husband and you get a farm wife to comfort you." She set the hammer down with a soft thunk. "But if you can't, if the work breaks you, or your family calls you home, or you decide this life is too hard for someone of your breeding, then you leave. No promises broken, no shame in admitting it's not for you. Just honesty about what you can and can't handle. Old Bjorn, who'd been invited to stay for the meal, nodded approvingly. Fair terms. Harsh but fair. The land doesn't care about your intentions, boy. It only cares about results. Torvald looked at the tools spread before him, each one representing knowledge he didn't possess, skills he'd never needed to develop. A season seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. His hands already ached from one day's work. How would they feel after weeks, months? "And if I succeed," he asked, "if I prove myself worthy?" For the first time since his arrival, something softened in Runa's expression. "Then you'll have earned the right to call this place home, and to call yourself my husband." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. Outside, wind rattled the windows and reminded them all that winter was coming, bringing with it challenges that would test every person on the farm. Torvald reached out and touched Eric's hammer, feeling the weight of all the work it represented, all the commitment it demanded. The golden arm ring on his other hand felt suddenly insignificant, a pretty bauble from a softer world. "I accept your terms," he said quietly. Magnus looked up sharply. "Just like that? You don't even know what you're agreeing to." "No," Torvald admitted, meeting the boy's challenging gaze. "But I know what I'm agreeing to leave behind. And I know that some things are worth fighting for, even when you don't know if you're strong enough to win." Runa studied his face in the firelight, searching for something only she knew how to recognize. "We'll see," she said finally. "Time and work will tell us what kind of man you really are." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain, failure, and stubborn persistence. Torvald's hands, once smooth as polished wood, began to crack and blister. Runa marked his progress on a piece of bark she kept by the hearth, not with words of encouragement, but with simple scratches that tracked the hardening of his palms, the slow development of calluses that spoke of genuine work. Each morning brought new lessons in humility. The simplest tasks that Magnus performed without thought became mountains for Torvald to climb. Splitting wood left him with aching shoulders and a pile of poorly cut logs that burned too quickly and gave too little heat. Hauling water from the well taught him muscles he never knew he possessed, each bucket a reminder of how soft his previous life had made him. But it was the small moments of progress that kept him going. The morning he managed to milk Brunhilde without being kicked felt like a victory worthy of celebration. When he successfully repaired a loose board in the chicken coop, crooked but functional, Magnus actually nodded with something approaching approval. "It's not pretty," the boy admitted, examining Torvald's handiwork, "but it'll hold. Father always said the important thing is that the work serves its purpose." Runa appeared beside them, carrying a basket of eggs from the morning collection. She tested Torvald's repair with one hand, pressing against the board to check its stability. It held firm. "Better," she said simply, but something in her tone suggested this single word carried weight. "You're learning to listen to the wood instead of fighting it." These moments of acknowledgement became precious to Torvald, small lights in the darkness of constant struggle. He began to understand that Runa's approval was not given lightly. It had to be earned through genuine improvement, not effort alone. Old Bjorn became an unexpected teacher, arriving each morning with stories wrapped around lessons. As they worked together clearing stones from the winter wheat field, the old farmer shared wisdom disguised as casual conversation. "Your hands are changing," Bjorn observed one particularly cold morning, watching Torvald work with the stone-pulling tools. "But the real change needs to happen up here." He tapped his temple with a dirt-stained finger. "A noble thinks the world should bend to his will. A farmer knows he must bend to the world's needs." The truth of those words became evident when letters began arriving from Torvald's former life. Astrid's messages came weekly, written in elegant script on fine parchment that seemed foreign in this rough farmhouse. Magnus discovered the first one when he was cleaning Torvald's things from the barn. "What's this?" the boy asked, holding up the sealed letter with curiosity. Torvald's stomach tightened as he recognized the formal seal of Astrid's house. "A message from my former betrothed." "Former?" Runa looked up from her mending, needle poised above a torn work shirt. I thought you'd settled all that before coming here. The weight of the letter felt heavier than any farming tool. Astrid doesn't accept that our arrangement is ended. She believes this is temporary madness that will pass. Runa set down her sewing and held out her hand. May I? Torvald hesitated. The letter contained reminders of the wealth he'd abandoned, descriptions of the comfortable life waiting for his return, and veiled threats about what his family would do if he persisted in this folly. It painted his current situation as a nobleman's passing fancy, a temporary rebellion against duty and good sense. She writes of the wedding preparations continuing, Runa said, after reading the letter carefully, of your father's patience wearing thin, of your duty to your bloodline and your people. Magnus looked between them with growing concern. Are you going back? No, Torvald said immediately, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The letter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. My place is here now. Runa folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. Your place is where you choose to make it. But choices made under pressure rarely hold firm when that pressure increases. That evening, as they sat around the table sharing the day's simple meal, the atmosphere felt strained. Magnus kept shooting worried glances at Torvald, while Runa seemed lost in thought, her usual directness replaced by careful observation. Tell me about your father, she said finally. What kind of man is he? Torvald considered the question while stirring his portion of vegetable stew. Strong, decisive, accustomed to being obeyed. He's built our family's wealth through careful alliances and strategic thinking. A good leader in his way, and he expects you to follow the same path? He expects me to honor my obligations, to think of the family's future before my own desires. Torvald met her gaze across the table. He would not understand this choice. Magnus set down his spoon with more force than necessary. Then why did you make it? If you knew it would bring trouble, why come here and make us part of your family's anger? The boy's question struck deep. Torvald realized he'd been so focused on what he was seeking that he'd given little thought to what his presence might cost this family. Runa and Magnus had built a stable life through hard work and careful planning. His arrival had introduced uncertainty and potential conflict they'd never asked for. I came because I believed, still believe, that some things are worth the risk, he said slowly. But you're right to ask that question. My choices affect more than just myself now. Runa reached across the table and touched her son's hand. Magnus raises fair concerns. We've worked hard to build security here. If your presence brings unwanted attention from powerful families, it won't, Torvald interrupted, then caught himself. I hope it won't, but I can't promise that. All I can promise is that I'll stand between you and any trouble that comes because of me. Old Bjorn, who had been quietly listening while enjoying his evening pipe, finally spoke up. Promises are easy words, boy. The test comes when keeping them requires more than you think you have to give. Later that night, as Torvald lay in his straw bed, listening to the wind whistle through the barn walls, he felt the full weight of what he'd undertaken. It wasn't just about learning to farm or proving his worthiness to Runa. He'd brought his complicated past into their simple life, and the consequences of that choice were only beginning to unfold. Through the thin wall, he could hear Runa and Magnus talking quietly by the dying fire. Do you think he'll stay? Magnus asked. When the real pressure comes from his family, when they threaten to disown him completely. I don't know, Runa admitted, but I think he's trying to become the kind of man who would stay. Whether he succeeds depends on how deep his commitment really goes, and if he fails, if he leaves when things get difficult. There was a long pause before Runa answered. Then we'll know we were right to protect our hearts, and we'll go back to managing on our own, as we always have. Torvald closed his eyes and flexed his blistered hands, feeling the soreness that came from honest work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his resolve. Astrid's letters would keep coming. His family's pressure would continue to build, and somewhere in the distance, winter waited with its own harsh lessons. But tonight, for the first time since his arrival, he felt like he might actually belong here. The calluses forming on his palms were more than just marks of labor. They were proof that he was changing, becoming someone who could earn the right to call this place home. The question was whether that change would happen fast enough to satisfy the demands of both the land and the woman who would judge his worthiness. The first harvest moon rose, full and golden over the farm, casting long shadows across fields that had become familiar territory to Torvald's aching muscles. 6 weeks had passed since his arrival, and the seasonal transition brought changes he could feel in his bones. The work had taken on a different rhythm now, less desperate fumbling, more confident purpose. The shared wooden bowl that held their evening meals had become something of a ritual. Each night, Runa would serve their simple fare: root vegetables from her garden, barley bread that Magnus helped bake, preserved meat that would need to last through the coming winter. The bowl passed between them with increasing ease, and Torvald noticed how the conversations had grown longer, more comfortable. "Your hands look like a farmer's now," Magnus observed one evening, comparing his own work-hardened palms to Torvald's developing calluses. "Father always said you could tell a man's worth by looking at his hands." It was the first time Magnus had mentioned his father without sadness shadowing his eyes, and Torvald felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "What else did your father say about hands?" Torvald asked, genuinely curious. Magnus glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "He said soft hands meant a soft mind, someone who let others do the thinking and working for them. But he also said hands that were hard from cruelty were worse than soft ones. The best hands were hard from helping." Runa smiled at her son's words, and Torvald caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been before life taught her to be so guarded. Eric was wise about such things. He could look at a person's hands and tell you their character. "What would he have said about mine?" Torvald asked, holding up his palms to the firelight. The blisters had hardened into proper calluses now, and the soft nobility had been scraped away by weeks of honest labor. "He would have said they're learning," Runa replied after a moment's consideration. "That they're willing to change. That's more than can be said for most people." The harvest work brought them closer together in ways that surprised Torvald. When the grain needed cutting, he found himself working alongside Runa in the fields, their movements gradually synchronizing as they moved through the rows of wheat. She corrected his technique with increasing patience, her hands occasionally covering his to guide the scythe's motion. Those brief touches sent unexpected warmth through him, not the calculated attraction he'd felt for noble ladies, but something deeper and more honest. Runa's hands were strong and competent, marked by years of work that had meaning. When she stood close enough to adjust his grip on the scythe handle, he caught the scent of sun-warmed skin and the herbs she used to wash her. You're learning to move with the grain instead of fighting it," she said one afternoon, as they paused to rest in the shade of an old oak tree. "The rhythm comes naturally now." Magnus worked nearby, gathering the cut grain into neat bundles, with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work since childhood. But Torvald noticed how the boy watched them together, his expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. "Mother's been happier lately," Magnus said that evening, as he and Torvald worked together preparing the animals for the night. "She sings while she works now. She stopped doing that after Father died." The observation hit Torvald unexpectedly. He'd been so focused on proving himself worthy of Runa's respect that he hadn't noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor. But Magnus was right. There was something lighter in her movements, something more hopeful in her voice. "She's an extraordinary woman," Torvald said carefully. "Strong in ways I never understood before coming here." Magnus nodded seriously. "Father used to say Mother was like the earth itself. She could make anything grow if you gave her time and trust." The boy paused in his work, studying Torvald's face. "Are you going to stay? Really stay, I mean, even when your noble friends come calling?" The question had gained urgency as more letters arrived from Torvald's former life. Astrid's messages had grown more insistent, and now included veiled threats about what his continued absence might mean for political alliances his father had carefully constructed. "I want to stay," Torvald said honestly. "But I won't lie to you. There are complications I'm still working through." "What kind of complications?" Torvald set down the feed bucket and met the boy's direct gaze. The kind that come when you abandon responsibilities to follow your heart. My family built their power through careful agreements with other noble houses. My marriage to Astrid was part of those agreements. Magnus frowned. So your leaving affects more than just you? It might. And that means I need to find a way to resolve things that doesn't bring trouble to your family. The boy considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned early that actions have consequences. Mother's been hurt enough, he said finally. If you're not sure you can stay, maybe you should leave before she gets too attached. That evening, old Bjorn arrived for their weekly shared meal, bringing news from the broader community and his usual mixture of wisdom and practical advice. As they sat around the table, he studied the family dynamics with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd seen many changes over his long life. You're settling in well, he observed to Torvald. The work's changing you in the right ways, but there's tension here that wasn't present before. Runa glanced up from serving the stew. What do you mean? The boy's worried about his mother's heart. The mother's worried about the boy's security. And the man's worried about both of them. Bjorn's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. Classic situation when people care about each other but haven't figured out how to say it directly. Magnus flushed red. I'm not worried. Nothing wrong with worry when it comes from love, Bjorn interrupted gently. Your father worried about your mother, and she worried about him. That's what families do. The word family hung in the air between them, carrying weight none of them had explicitly acknowledged. They weren't a family yet, might never be one, but the shape of that possibility had begun to form around their shared meals and common work. The question, Bjorn continued, is what you're all willing to risk to find out what you might become together later. As Torvald walked Runa to the well to draw water for the morning, they found themselves alone in the moonlight for the first time since his arrival. The easy companionship of the workday gave way to something more complex, more charged with possibility. Magnus asked me something today, Runa said as they worked the well's rope system together. He wanted to know if I was falling in love with you. Torvald's hands stilled on the rope. What did you tell him? I told him it was too early to know. She paused, studying his face in the moonlight. But that wasn't entirely honest. I know what I'm feeling. The question is whether what you're feeling is real enough to weather the storms that are coming. The bucket reached the bottom of the well with a distant splash. As they hauled it back up together, their hands touching on the rope, Torvald felt the full weight of what was growing between them, fragile as new grain, precious as water in drought. What I feel is more real than anything I've ever experienced, he said quietly. But you're right to question whether it's strong enough. I'm still learning what real commitment means. Runa nodded slowly. Then we'll learn together. But Torvald, if the time comes when you have to choose between this life and your old one, don't make the choice based on what you think I want to hear. Make it based on who you really are. The water bucket emerged from the well, heavy with promise and uncertainty, much like the future they were slowly, carefully building together. The morning frost came earlier than expected, painting the farm in silver and reminding everyone that winter would not wait for human plans. As Torvald and Runa worked together preserving the last of the harvest vegetables, their conversation turned to practical matters that carried deeper significance. If we're to marry before the winter solstice, Runa said, carefully layering turnips in sand for storage, we need to discuss the ceremony. I won't have some elaborate noble affair that costs more than most families see in a year. Torvald looked up from the apples he was wrapping individually in cloth. Over the past weeks, he'd given little thought to the actual wedding ceremony, focused as he'd been on proving himself worthy of having one at all. What kind of ceremony would you want? Simple, honest. Runa's hands moved efficiently through her work, but her voice carried the weight of careful consideration. Old Bjorn could speak the binding words. He served as elder for such ceremonies before. Magnus could stand witness for my family. Perhaps a few neighbors, a shared meal afterward. The simplicity of her vision struck him as perfectly right. No grand halls filled with political allies, no elaborate feasts designed to display wealth and power. Just the people who mattered gathered to witness something real. That sounds perfect, he said, and meant it. Magnus appeared in the storage room doorway, carrying the wedding planning notes Runa had been making on pieces of birch bark. The boy had been unusually quiet lately, and Torvald noticed the careful way he set down the bark sheets, as if they contained something fragile. "These are your plans?" Magnus asked, studying his mother's simple list. "Food for 12 people, old Bjorn to officiate, ceremony in the main room by the hearth. Do you think it's not enough?" Runa asked, genuine concern in her voice. "I think Father would have liked it," Magnus said after a moment. "He always said the best celebrations were the ones where people actually talked to each other instead of just trying to impress." The moment was interrupted by the sound of horses in the farmyard, not the single mount of a neighbor or traveling merchant, but the organized clatter of a full retinue. Through the small window, Torvald caught sight of familiar banners snapping in the wind, and his stomach dropped. "My family," he said quietly. "They've come." Runa set down her work and moved to look outside. A dozen riders filled the farmyard, their fine clothes and elaborate horse trappings a stark contrast to the farm's simple functionality. At their head rode Sigurd the Bold, Torvald's father, his face set in lines of grim determination. "They don't look like they've come for a friendly visit," Magnus observed, unconsciously moving closer to his mother. Torvald straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment. "No, they've come to take me home." The confrontation began the moment Torvald stepped outside. His father dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command, his eyes taking in the humble farmstead with undisguised disapproval. "Torvald!" Sigurd's voice carried the chill of northern winds. "Enough of this foolishness. You've had your rebellion, made your point. Now it's time to return to your responsibilities." Behind him, the other riders remained mounted, a subtle but clear display of force. Among them, Torvald recognized his uncle Harold, several family allies, and most troubling of all, Astrid herself, elegant and untouchable in her riding furs. "Father," Torvald kept his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I didn't expect you to travel so far for a simple conversation." "Simple?" Sigurd's laugh was harsh. "You disappear without word, abandon your betrothal, ignore every message sent to recall you, and you call this simple. Your actions have consequences beyond your own selfish desires." Runa appeared beside Torvald, Magnus close behind her. Torvald felt a moment of fierce pride at how she faced this intimidating group, straight-backed, unimpressed by their wealth and power, every inch the equal of any noble. "You must be the widow," Sigurd said, his tone carrying just enough courtesy to avoid outright insult. "I'm sure you're a good woman, but you must understand that my son has obligations that transcend personal preference." "I understand that your son is old enough to make his own choices," Runa replied calmly, "and that those choices should be respected." Astrid urged her horse forward, studying Runa with calculating eyes. "How charming! But surely you realize this is temporary. Torvald will tire of playing farmer when winter truly sets in, when the novelty wears thin. Perhaps you should ask Torvald what he wants," Magnus said suddenly, his young voice carrying surprising strength. Instead of talking about him like he's not here, the boy's boldness earned him sharp looks from several riders, but Torvald felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, the protective instinct of a man defending his family. "What I want," Torvald said clearly, "is to build a life here. With Runa and Magnus, the life I should have chosen long ago." His uncle Harold leaned forward in his saddle. "And the trade agreements that depend on your marriage to Astrid? The alliances your father spent years building? Do those mean nothing? To you? They mean I made mistakes in the past that I'm trying to correct now," Torvald replied. "Mistakes that would have led to a loveless marriage and a hollow life." Sigurd's face darkened. "Hollow? You speak of hollowness while throwing away everything our family has built, the wealth, the power, the security we've provided for generations. What good is security built on lies?" Torvald shot back. What good is power that requires me to betray my own heart? The argument might have escalated further, but old Bjorn chose that moment to appear, walking slowly from his neighboring field with the deliberate pace of a man who'd seen enough conflicts to know when intervention was needed. Quite a gathering, the old farmer observed mildly, nodding to the assembled nobles as if they were any other visitors. Fine horses, though they'll need water and feed if you're planning to stay long. Something about Bjorn's calm presence seemed to diffuse the immediate tension. Sigurd straightened, remembering his manners despite his anger. "We won't be staying," he said formally. "We've come to collect my son and return him to his proper place." "Ah." Bjorn scratched his beard thoughtfully. "And has the boy agreed to be collected?" "The boy," Astrid interjected with silky precision, "has responsibilities that supersede his current infatuation." Runa stiffened at the word infatuation, and Torvald saw something flash in her eyes, not anger but hurt. The dismissive term reduced everything they'd built together to a nobleman's passing fancy. "If you'll excuse us," Torvald said, his decision crystallizing, "I need to speak with my family privately. Runa? Magnus? Could you give us a few moments?" As his chosen family withdrew to the house, Torvald faced the mounted nobles who represented everything he'd left behind. The contrast between their elaborate display and the honest simplicity of the farm had never been starker. "Well," his father demanded, "are you ready to end this madness and come home?" Torvald looked at the house where Runa and Magnus waited, at the fields he'd learned to tend, at the life he'd begun to build with his own hands. Then he looked back at his father's expectant face. "This is my home now," he said quietly, "and I'm not leaving." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the distant lowing of cattle, the sounds of a world that had taught him what really mattered. The confrontation with his family left ripples that spread through the following days like stones thrown into still water. Though Sigurd and his retinue had departed with threats and ultimatums, their presence lingered in the careful silences that punctuated conversations around the farm. The wedding, now only days away, felt both inevitable and impossibly fragile. Torvald noticed how Runa moved through her daily tasks with mechanical precision, her usual warm efficiency replaced by something more guarded. She spoke when necessary, smiled when Magnus told stories, but something had withdrawn behind her eyes, something that Astrid's casual cruelty had damaged. Magnus felt the tension too, throwing himself into wedding preparations with an intensity that spoke of his own fears. The boy worked with old Bjorn to arrange the simple ceremony, cleaned the main room until it gleamed, and prepared Eric's memorial. Stone as if the success of these tasks could somehow guarantee his family's continued happiness. It was the memorial stone that finally broke the fragile peace. Torvald found Runa there on the morning before their wedding, kneeling in the frost-touched grass beside the simple marker that bore her first husband's name. Her shoulders shook with silent tears, and the sight hit him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," she said, when she noticed his approach, quickly wiping her eyes. "I know this isn't fair to you, coming here the day before." "Don't apologize," Torvald said gently, settling beside her on the cold ground. "Tell me what you're feeling." Runa stared at the rough stone for a long moment before speaking. Eric was so certain about everything. He knew he wanted to farm this land, knew he wanted to marry me, knew exactly how to build the life we shared. There was never any doubt in him, never any question about whether he'd made the right choice. She turned to look at Torvald, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But with you, there's always this shadow of your other life. Even when you say you're committed, even when you work beside me and call this home, part of me wonders if you're just convincing yourself. If someday you'll wake up and realize you've given up too much." The honesty of her words cut deep because they echoed his own hidden fears. "And yesterday, when your family came, yesterday made it real," she finished. "Seeing what you've actually sacrificed, hearing that woman talk about our life as if it's just a passing fancy." It made me wonder if I'm being selfish, asking you to give up so much for something that might not last. Torvald reached for her hand, feeling the calluses that matched his own now, marks of their shared work, their growing partnership. Look at me, Runa. When she met his eyes, he saw not just fear, but something deeper, the vulnerability of a woman who'd lost love before and knew how much it could cost to risk it again. Eric was certain, because he'd never known any other kind of life, Torvald said carefully. His choice was simple because he didn't have competing loyalties, competing obligations. My choice is more complicated, yes, but that doesn't make it less real. He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between them. You want to know the difference between what I felt for Astrid and what I feel for you. With Astrid, I was choosing a role, the dutiful son, the political ally, the noble husband. With you, I'm choosing to become someone I've never been before, someone better. Runa's fingers tightened around his. But what if you can't? What if the man you're trying to become isn't strong enough to survive the pressures that are coming? Then I'll fail, he said simply. But I'd rather fail trying to be worthy of you than succeed at being someone I despise. They sat in silence for a while, the memorial stone between them like a bridge connecting past and future. Finally, Runa spoke again, her voice stronger. Eric used to say that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a decision you made every day, when the work got hard, when doubts crept in, when other options looked easier. She touched the stone gently. I need to know that you understand that you're not just choosing me in this moment, but choosing to keep choosing me through whatever comes. Every day, Torvald promised. Through harvest and winter, through doubt and certainty, through whatever storms my family brings to our door. Every day I choose you. Magnus found them there an hour later, carrying a wooden box that had belonged to his father. The boy's face was solemn as he knelt beside them, opening the box to reveal a simple iron ring, rough forged, practical, worn smooth by years of wear. Father's wedding ring, Magnus said quietly. Mother, I think you should give it to Torvald tomorrow as part of the ceremony. Runa's breath caught. Magnus, are you sure? Your father would want his family to be happy, the boy finished firmly. And you are my family, both of you. Father's gone, but what he built here continues. What he taught us about love and work and commitment, that's still alive. Magnus looked directly at Torvald, his young face serious beyond his years. But I need you to promise me something. Promise that if you ever decide this life isn't enough, if you ever want to go back to being a lord, you'll tell us honestly. Don't just disappear one morning and leave us wondering what we did wrong. The request was so mature, so painfully aware of how adults could fail the children who depended on them, that Torvald felt his chest tighten with emotion. I promise, he said solemnly, and I promise something else. I will never make you wonder what you did wrong, because nothing you could do would drive me away. You're my son now, if you'll have me. Not because I married your mother, but because you've earned my respect and my love. Magnus blinked rapidly, fighting tears that threatened to spill over. Even though I'm not your blood? Especially because you're not my blood, Torvald replied. Blood doesn't make a family, Magnus. Choice does. Work does, love does. And I choose to be your father, if you'll choose to be my son. The boy threw himself into Torvald's arms with all the desperate affection of a child who'd learned not to take love for granted. Over Magnus's shoulder, Torvald met Runa's eyes and saw something there that hadn't been present before. Complete acceptance, absolute trust. Tomorrow then, she said softly, we become a family in truth. Old Bjorn appeared at the edge of the small graveyard, his timing impeccable as always. Thought I might find you here, he called out. The neighbors are starting to arrive for tomorrow's celebration, and there's a matter of the ceremony itself we need to discuss. As they walked back toward the house together, Torvald and Runa on either side of Magnus, old Bjorn leading the way with his measured steps, the farm looked different somehow. Not just a place where Torvald was learning to belong, but home in the truest sense of the word. Behind them, Eric's memorial stone stood quiet in the gathering dusk, no longer a barrier between past and future, but a foundation upon which new love could build. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own tests of commitment and courage. But tonight, for the first time since his arrival, Torvald felt truly certain of his choice. Whatever storms might come, he would face them not as a displaced noble playing at farming, but as a man who had found his true calling in the love of a remarkable woman and the trust of her extraordinary son. The golden arm ring still lay in his traveling pack, a reminder of what he'd left behind. Tomorrow he would trade it for iron, practical, honest, and strong enough to last a lifetime. The wedding morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering like scattered diamonds across the farmyard. Torvald woke before sunrise, his stomach tight with anticipation and a happiness so pure it almost frightened him. Today he would marry Runa. Today Magnus would truly become his son. Today he would formally claim his place in this family that had accepted him despite all his flaws and failures. He was adjusting his best tunic, simple wool, but clean and mended with care, when he heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Through the barn's small window, he watched a rider in royal colors dismount near the house, carrying what appeared to be an official document case. Torvald's blood chilled. Royal messengers on wedding mornings rarely brought good news. By the time he reached the house, Runa had already invited the messenger inside. The man, young and serious, wore the insignia of the king's personal service, not just any royal messenger, but one entrusted with matters of highest importance. Lord Torvald Sigurdsson, the messenger said formally, "I bear documents that require your immediate attention, documents that affect the legality of any marriage you might." Contract today. He opened the leather case and withdrew a scroll sealed with the king's own mark, thick, parchment that spoke of laws and consequences beyond any individual's power to ignore. "What documents?" Runa asked, her voice steady despite the fear Torvald could see gathering in her eyes. The messenger unrolled the scroll with practiced efficiency. A legal marriage contract executed by Lord Sigurdsson's father in accordance with inheritance laws of the Northern Territories, and a royal decree concerning the obligations of noble houses to maintain their sworn alliances. Torvald's hands shook as he took the documents. The first was exactly what he'd feared, a binding marriage contract between himself and Astrid Eriksdottir, registered with the crown and carrying the full weight of law. But it was the second document that made his vision blur with shock. "Read it aloud," Runa said quietly. "Let us all know what we're facing." Torvald's voice cracked as he began to read. "By royal decree, all noble marriages contracted within the realm must comply with inheritance laws regarding bloodline purity and alliance obligations. Any heir to a major house who marries outside approved noble lineages forfeits all claims to inheritance, property and protection under the crown." Magnus stepped closer to his mother, understanding enough to sense disaster, even if the legal language confused him. "What does that mean?" Old Bjorn, who had arrived early to help with wedding preparations, spoke with grim understanding. "It means if Torvald marries your mother, he loses everything. And more than that, it means this farm loses the protection his family name has been providing." The messenger nodded confirmation. "Furthermore, any property or alliances dependent on the Sigurdsson name would be forfeit. That includes," he consulted another document, "protection agreements for several lowland farms, including this one." The words hit like physical blows. Torvald had known his choice would cost him his inheritance, but he'd never considered how it might affect Runa and Magnus. His family's protection had been quietly shielding this farm from various pressures, taxes, land disputes, claims from neighboring lords who might otherwise have found excuses to seize productive farmland from a widow and her young son. "There's more," the messenger continued remorselessly. "Lord Jarl Gunnar of the Eastern Territories has filed a formal claim on this land, citing the dissolution of Sigurdsson protection. Unless Lord Torvald fulfills his marriage obligations to maintain family alliances, this property will be seized within the month. Runa sank onto the wooden bench by the table, her face pale as winter morning. So if you marry me, we lose the farm anyway. And if you don't marry me, you still lose the farm, Torvald finished, the full scope of the trap becoming clear. My father has orchestrated this perfectly. Either I return and marry Astrid, or the people I love lose everything. Magnus's young face twisted with anger. It's not fair. This is our home. We've worked for everything we have. They can't just take it because some nobles made agreements we never signed. Fairness has little to do with law, old Bjorn said heavily. When powerful men make plans, ordinary people pay the price. The messenger cleared his throat diplomatically. There is one alternative mentioned in the documents. If Lord Torvald were to return within 7 days and complete his original marriage contract, all previous agreements would be honored. The farm's protection would be restored, and no penalties would be levied. And if he doesn't? Runa asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Then the legal marriage contract between Lord Torvald and Lady Astrid is considered broken, triggering forfeiture clauses. The land seizure proceeds, and Lord Torvald is stripped of all noble rights and protections. Silence filled the room like winter fog, heavy and cold. Everything they'd worked toward, everything they'd built together, hung in the balance of decisions made by people who'd never set foot on this farm, never understood what it meant to build something with your own hands. How long have you known? Runa asked Torvald, her voice carefully controlled. Known what? About the marriage contract. About what your leaving would cost us. Torvald met her eyes, seeing the hurt and suspicion there that he'd hoped never to see again. I knew about the contract. I knew my father had legal agreements with Astrid's family. But I swear to you, I didn't know about the protection agreements. I didn't know my choice would put your home at risk. But you suspected there might be consequences beyond just losing your inheritance. The question hung between them like a blade. Torvald could lie, could claim complete ignorance, but the trust they'd built deserved better than that. I suspected my father wouldn't let me go easily, he admitted. But I thought the worst that could happen was losing my place in the family. I never imagined he'd use innocent people as leverage. Magnus spoke up suddenly, his voice tight with betrayal. So you brought this here. Your family problems, your noble politics. You brought all of it to our door. And now we're going to lose everything because of your choices. Magnus, Runa warned. But the boy's anger was justified and they all knew it. No, Mother. You asked me to trust him, to give him a chance, and I did. I started to think of him as family. But family doesn't put each other at risk for their own desires. The accusation hit harder than any physical blow. Torvald saw his own worst fears reflected in Magnus's eyes, that he was indeed just a selfish noble who'd thought he could escape consequences by running away, never considering who might pay the price for his freedom. Old Bjorn rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man making a difficult decision. The boy speaks truth, hard as it is to hear. And now we all need to decide what comes next. The messenger, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before him, rolled up his documents. I'm required to wait for Lord Torvald's formal response to these documents. The 7-day period begins today. 7 days, Runa repeated slowly. 7 days to decide between your happiness and our survival. It's not that simple, isn't it? She stood, her composure cracking for the first time since the messenger's arrival. You have a choice, Torvald. Go back to your noble life, marry the woman you're legally bound to, and this family keeps their home. Or stay here, marry me, and watch us lose everything anyway. There has to be another way. If there is, we have 7 days to find it, old Bjorn said pragmatically. But hoping for miracles is poor planning. We need to consider what's actually possible. The wedding guests would be arriving soon, expecting to witness a celebration. Instead, they'd find a family torn apart by forces beyond their control, facing impossible choices with no good outcomes. Torvald looked at the legal documents in his hands, formal parchment that reduced love to contractual obligations, that turned personal choices into political weapons. Then he looked at Runa and Magnus, at the life he'd thought he was claiming, now slipping away like water through his fingers. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. Runa's smile was sad and infinitely weary. "I want you to do what's right, for everyone involved. Even if that means admitting this was all a beautiful mistake." Outside, the sounds of approaching neighbors could be heard. Old Bjorn's wife bringing food for the celebration. Other farming families coming to witness what they'd thought would be a joyful union. Now those same people would learn that their own security might be threatened by the political machinations of distant nobles. 7 days. 7 days to find a solution that didn't exist. Or accept that sometimes love alone wasn't enough to overcome the brutal realities of power and law. The wedding was postponed, the guests quietly informed of complications requiring delay. But as Torvald watched Runa explain to concerned neighbors that things would be sorted out soon, he wondered if any of them, including himself, truly believed that anymore. The trap was perfect, the choice impossible, and the clock was already ticking toward a deadline that would force him to choose between the two things he valued most: his newfound family and their continued safety. The first day after the messenger's arrival passed in a haze of desperate planning and painful silences. Torvald found himself caught between the need to find a solution and the growing certainty that no solution existed. But as the second day dawned grey and bitter, a different kind of resolve began to crystallize in his chest. He sought out old Bjorn in the early morning light, finding the old farmer mending tools in his workshop with the methodical patience of a man who'd learned that most problems could be solved with steady work and clear thinking. "I need counsel," Torvald said without preamble, "from someone who's seen enough of life to know the difference between noble gestures and practical solutions." Bjorn set down the awl he'd been using to repair a leather harness and studied Torvald's face. "Speak your mind, then. But know that good counsel often sounds harsh when a man's heart is pulling him toward beautiful foolishness." "What if I renounce everything?" Torvald asked. "Not just the inheritance, but the title itself. Strip away every legal claim to nobility that gives my father power over me." The old farmer's eyebrows rose. "That's not just burning bridges, boy. That's dynamiting the riverbank. Once you formally renounce noble status, there's no taking it back. You'd be nobody in the eyes of the law, no more protection than any common farmer. But would it work? Would it free me from the marriage contract?" Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Legally? Maybe. If you're no longer Lord Torvald Sigurdsson, then contracts binding Lord Torvald Sigurdsson might become void. But it's a gamble with stakes you can't afford to lose." "Explain." "If the renunciation breaks the marriage contract but doesn't protect this farm from seizure, you'll have sacrificed everything for nothing. Runa and Magnus will still lose their home, and you'll have no power left to help them." The brutal logic of it hit hard, but Torvald pressed on. "What would it take to make the renunciation legally binding, unbreakable?" "Witnesses," Bjorn said immediately. "Official documentation. In timing, it would need to be filed before the 7-day deadline expires, but also before Jarl Gunnar can complete his land seizure." That afternoon, Torvald approached Magnus with a request that felt both necessary and terrifying. He found the boy in the barn, aggressively mucking stalls with a fury that spoke of frustration and fear. "Magnus," Torvald began carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if it hurts." The boy paused in his work, gripping the rake handle with white knuckles. "Are you leaving?" "I'm trying to find a way to stay, but that might require me to give up things that would affect your future too. Things you should have a say in." Magnus leaned on the rake, suddenly looking older than his 14 years. "What things?" "If I renounce my noble status completely, not just walk away from it, but legally destroy any claim to it forever, it might break the contracts that are threatening us. But it would also mean I could never offer you the opportunities that come with noble connections. No chance to learn at great halls, no introductions to powerful families, no shortcuts to advancement. The boy was quiet for so long that Torvald wondered if he'd misunderstood the question. Finally, Magnus spoke, his voice steady and sure. Do you think I want shortcuts earned with someone else's blood and sweat? Do you think I want to advance myself by being connected to people who would destroy our home for political convenience? Magnus, my father taught me that a man's worth comes from what he builds with his own hands, not what he inherits from others. If becoming nobody in the eyes of the law means you can stay and be my real father, then I say, burn every noble document that exists. The fierce loyalty in the boy's voice brought unexpected tears to Torvald's eyes. Even if it means we'll always be simple farmers? Even if it means harder work, fewer opportunities, no grand future? Especially then, Magnus said firmly, because that would mean our success is actually ours. That evening, Runa found Torvald sitting by Eric's memorial stone, working by lamplight on sheets of parchment covered with careful writing. The sight of him there, in the place where she'd confronted her fears about remarriage, felt somehow fitting. What are you writing? She asked, settling beside him in the grass. Legal documents, he replied, showing her the pages. A formal renunciation of all claims to noble status, inheritance, and family protection. If I can get this properly witnessed and filed, it might break the marriage contract and free us from these legal traps. Runa read over the carefully worded text, her expression growing more troubled with each line. Torvald, this doesn't just give up your inheritance. This destroys any legal protection you might have. If something goes wrong, if we lose the farm anyway, you'll have nothing left to fall back on. I'll have you and Magnus. And this land, if we can save it, but what if we can't save it? What if your sacrifice doesn't work, and we lose everything regardless? He set down his pen and turned to face her fully. Then at least I'll have tried everything. At least I won't spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have fought harder for what matters most. Runa was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. Eric used to say that the measure of a man wasn't in what he achieved, but in what he was willing to risk for the people he loved. I never understood how profound that was until now. Does that mean you approve? It means I'm terrified and proud and heartbroken all at once, she admitted. Terrified that you're gambling everything on a legal technicality that might not work. Proud that you're willing to become nothing in order to be everything to us. And heartbroken that it's come to this choice at all. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Astrid herself, arriving alone and looking far less composed than she had during the family confrontation. She dismounted in the farmyard with the careful grace of someone steeling herself for an unpleasant task. I need to speak with you, she said to Torvald without preamble. About the marriage contract and what it actually means. They sat at Runa's simple wooden table, an odd trio bound together by circumstances none of them had chosen. Astrid's elegant clothes seemed out of place in the humble farmhouse, but her manner was more genuine than Torvald had ever seen it. I didn't know about the land seizure, she began, about what my father and yours had planned if you refused to honor the contract. When I learned about it yesterday, I realized I needed to come and speak honestly about what we're all facing. Runa leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? The marriage contract isn't just about Torvald and me, Astrid explained. It's part of a larger alliance designed to unite several noble houses against what they see as growing threats from the crown. Your farm is just one small piece in a much larger political game. Torvald felt his stomach drop. How large a game? Large enough that even if you renounce your noble status, they might still find ways to seize this land. The alliance needs to demonstrate strength, and taking property from those who oppose noble interests sends a clear message. The implications hit like cold water. Even complete sacrifice might not be enough to protect the people he loved. Then what do you suggest? Runa asked, her voice carefully controlled. Astrid hesitated, then spoke with surprising resolve. I suggest we break the alliance from within. I've been reviewing the contract terms, and there's a provision that might help us. If I formally release Torvald from the marriage obligation, Not because he's renouncing nobility, but because I'm choosing to dissolve the engagement. It changes the legal framework entirely. You would do that? Torvald asked, genuinely surprised. I don't want a husband who loves someone else, Astrid replied simply. And I don't want to be part of a system that destroys innocent people for political gain. But there's a cost. If I break the engagement, my family loses significant political standing. And yours will likely disown you anyway. Old Bjorn, who had been listening quietly from his corner chair, finally spoke up. So the question becomes whether two noble families destroying each other politically will create enough chaos to protect one small farm. Possibly, Astrid acknowledged, but it's risky, and it requires all of us to trust each other completely. As they discussed the complex web of legal and political maneuvering required, Torvald realized they were planning something unprecedented. Nobles and farmers working together to subvert a system designed to keep them apart. The irony wasn't lost on him that his path to freedom required the cooperation of the woman he'd rejected and the sacrifice of the very status that had made him desirable to her in the first place. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the turbulent forces about to collide over this small farm and the families whose futures hung in the balance. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when all their careful planning would either triumph or crumble under the weight of forces much larger than themselves. The renunciation papers lay complete on the table, ready to be signed and witnessed. But now they represented just one weapon in a larger battle, a battle that would determine not just whether Torvald could stay, but whether love and honor could triumph over politics and power in a world designed to crush those who dared to choose differently. Time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. The final confrontation came with the dawn of the seventh day, when a formal procession arrived at the farm carrying banners of 3 noble houses and the royal seal of legal authority. Jarl Gunnar led the group, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him like winter frost. Behind him rode Torvald's father Sigurd, Astrid's father Earl Magnus, and a crown magistrate empowered to enforce the king's decrees. They found the farm's residents assembled in the main yard, not cowering or hiding, but standing together with the quiet dignity of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Torvald stood between Runa and Magnus, while old Bjorn flanked them with several neighboring farmers who had come to witness whatever resolution would unfold. Lord Torvald Sigurdsson, Jarl Gunnar announced in a voice that carried across the farmyard like a battle horn. You have reached the end of your 7 days. Honor your legal obligations and return to your proper station, or face the consequences of your rebellion. I have an answer, Torvald replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. But first, I require that all parties hear the complete legal situation they're attempting to enforce. He drew out the formal documents he'd prepared, along with a separate scroll that Astrid had provided the night before. The crowd stirred with curiosity and tension as he unrolled the first parchment. These are formal renunciation papers, Torvald announced clearly, a complete and irrevocable abandonment of all claims to noble status, inheritance rights, and family protection. Witnessed, sealed, and legally binding under crown law, Sigurd's face darkened with fury. You cannot be serious. You would throw away everything our family has built for generations? I would choose my own path rather than be bound by choices made before my birth, Torvald replied. And I would protect the people I love from being used as weapons in other men's political games. Jarl Gunnar studied the documents with professional interest, clearly recognizing their legal validity. Clever. If you're no longer Lord Torvald Sigurdsson, then contracts binding Lord Torvald Sigurdsson become void. But you realize this also strips away any legal protection you might claim. You become nobody in the eyes of the law. Better to be nobody with honor than somebody bound by obligations that require me to sacrifice love for political convenience. Magnus stepped forward then, carrying a wooden box that had belonged to his father. The boy's hands were steady as he opened it to reveal Eric's sword. Simple steel, well maintained, but clearly the weapon of a working man rather than a nobleman. "I offer this to my father," Magnus said formally, his young voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Not to Torvald Sigurdsson, who no longer exists, but to the man who chose to become part of our family." The symbolism was unmistakable. In accepting the sword, Torvald would be accepting adoption into a farmer's family, claiming kinship through choice rather than blood. It was a direct rejection of everything noble society valued: bloodlines, inherited status, political alliances built through strategic marriages. Torvald reached for the sword with hands that had learned to work, that bore the calluses of honest labor. As his fingers closed around the grip, he felt the weight of a lifetime's worth of expectations falling away. "I accept this sword and the family bond it represents," he said formally. "I'm no longer Torvald Sigurdsson, heir to noble houses and bound by noble contracts. I am simply Torvald, farmer and husband and father by choice." The Crown Magistrate cleared his throat diplomatically. "The renunciation appears legally sound. However, the land seizure order was filed against this property regardless of regardless of Torvald's status. Jarl Gunnar's claim stands independently of the marriage contract." Here was the moment when their careful planning would either triumph or collapse. Astrid urged her horse forward, drawing a scroll from her saddlebags with deliberate ceremony. "Actually," she said clearly, "I believe you'll find that claim has been invalidated." She handed the document to the magistrate, who read it with growing surprise. "This is a formal dissolution of engagement, filed 3 days ago with the royal court. Lady Astrid Eriksdotter hereby releases all parties from the marriage alliance and requests that associated political agreements be considered void." Earl Magnus turned toward his daughter with shock and growing anger. "Astrid, what have you done?" "What I should have done years ago," she replied calmly. "I've chosen my own path instead of being a piece in someone else's political game. The marriage alliance is broken by my choice, not by Torvald's defiance. That changes the legal framework significantly." Jarl Gunnar's expression shifted from confidence to concern as he realized the implications. If the marriage alliance was dissolved by the woman's choice rather than the man's rebellion, then the punitive measures designed to force compliance became legally questionable. The magistrate studied both documents carefully, clearly weighing complex legal precedents. "This is highly unusual. A simultaneous renunciation of nobility and dissolution of marriage contract by mutual agreement of the affected parties." Mutual agreement. Sigurd thundered. "This is conspiracy and betrayal. This is choice." Runa spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her place through years of hard work. "The choice to value love and honor over political convenience. The choice to build families through commitment rather than contract." Earl Bjorn stepped forward with the measured pace of a man who had seen enough conflict to know when to speak. "And it's the choice of free people to support those who choose love over power. This community stands with this family." The neighboring farmers murmured agreement, a quiet chorus of voices that represented something more powerful than noble authority: the solidarity of people who understood the value of honest work and authentic commitment. The confrontation had become something unprecedented. A peaceful rebellion that used the law itself as a weapon against political manipulation. By renouncing everything the system valued, Torvald had found a way to escape its control. By choosing dissolution over enforcement, Astrid had broken the alliance that gave that system its power over this small farm. But the most powerful moment came when the Crown Magistrate, after long consideration of the documents before him, finally spoke his judgment. The Crown Magistrate's deliberation seemed to stretch forever, the silence broken only by the morning wind and the distant sounds of farm animals going about their daily routines. When he finally looked up from the documents, his expression was grave but resolute. "In my judgment," he announced formally, The simultaneous renunciation of noble status and dissolution of marriage contract by mutual consent creates a legal situation that invalidates the punitive land seizure. The Crown's interest was in enforcing noble marriage obligations, obligations that no longer exist for parties who are no longer bound by noble law. Jarl Gunnar's face flushed with anger. This is legal trickery. The land claim stands regardless of marriage contracts. Actually, it doesn't, the magistrate replied calmly. Your claim was filed specifically as enforcement action against a rebellious noble heir. If there is no noble heir, there is no rebellion to punish. The property remains with its current owners under common law. The words hit the assembled nobles like physical blows. Years of careful political maneuvering, designed to strengthen their position against royal authority, had been undone by the simple choice of two people to walk away from the system entirely. Sigurd turned toward his son, former son, with an expression of absolute finality. You are no longer my blood, no longer welcome in my halls. You have chosen peasant life, and peasant life you shall have with all its hardships and limitations. I understand, Torvald replied quietly, and I accept those consequences gladly. Astrid dismounted and approached Runa with surprising grace. I hope you'll forgive the chaos my family has brought to your door, and I hope you'll accept my congratulations on your upcoming marriage. Thank you, Runa said simply. That couldn't have been an easy choice for you, easier than living a lie for the rest of my life, Astrid replied. I wish you both happiness. As the legal procession prepared to depart, some in anger, others in grudging respect, old Bjorn stepped forward with characteristic timing. Since the magistrate is here, and we have proper witnesses assembled, perhaps we could proceed with the wedding ceremony that was postponed 7 days ago. The suggestion was so practical, so perfectly suited to the moment, that even some of the departing nobles paused to watch. Here, in the farmyard where political power had just been defeated by personal choice, two people would finally claim the life they'd fought so hard to build together. Runa disappeared into the house and emerged moments later wearing her best dress, simple homespun wool, but clean and carefully mended, with small flowers from her garden tucked into her hair. Magnus stood beside her wearing Eric's best tunic, carrying the iron rings they'd forged from old farming tools. The ceremony itself was everything Runa had wanted, honest, simple, surrounded by people who knew the true cost of the commitment being made. Bjorn spoke the binding words with the authority of someone who'd witnessed many marriages and understood which ones would last. Marriage, he said, addressing not just the couple, but the small gathering of neighbors and friends, isn't about pretty promises made in easy times. It's about the choice to keep choosing each other when choosing gets difficult. These two have already proven they understand that truth. When the time came to exchange rings, Torvald removed his golden arm ring, the last symbol of his noble birth, and handed it to Magnus. This represents everything I was, he said clearly. I give it to you not as inheritance, but as a reminder that worth comes from character, not birthright. Sell it, melt it down, or keep it as you choose, but know that I value the iron ring you've made for me far more than all the gold I've ever owned. Magnus accepted the golden ring with solemn ceremony, then handed Torvald the simple iron band that had been forged from Eric's old farming tools. This represents everything you've become, a man who earns his place through work and love. As Torvald slipped the iron ring onto his finger, he felt the final transformation complete itself. The soft-handed noble who had arrived months ago was truly gone, replaced by someone who understood that real wealth came from meaningful relationships and honest work. Runa's ring was equally simple. Iron forged by the same hands that had made Torvald's, representing their partnership in all things. When old Bjorn pronounced them married, the small cheer that went up from their neighbors carried more genuine joy than any grand celebration in noble halls. The kiss they shared was witnessed by people who knew exactly what it had cost and what it meant, not just the beginning of a marriage, but the triumph of love over power, choice over obligation, authenticity over political convenience. As the last of the legal procession disappeared down the road, the new family stood together in their farmyard, surrounded by the life they'd chosen to build. The threats were ended, the choices made, the future finally theirs to determine. Magnus looked at his new father with eyes bright with pride and belonging. "So what happens now?" Torvald smiled, feeling the weight of Eric's sword at his side and the simple iron ring on his finger. "Now we get back to work. There's hay to cut, animals to tend, and a farm to run. Together." The word "together" carried all the weight of their journey, all the promise of their future. They had won something more precious than gold or status. They had won the right to choose their own path and walk it as a family bound not by blood or law, but by love, freely given and gratefully received. Winter was coming, but they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with strong hands and stronger hearts. In the home they had built with their own choices and defended with their own courage. 6 months later, the first spring thaw revealed a farm transformed not just by the changing seasons, but by the steady work of hands that had learned to move in harmony. Torvald knelt in the muddy field, planting seeds with the same careful attention Eric had once shown, while Runa worked beside him, marking rows with the precision of someone who understood that small details determined large harvests. The document that lay safely stored in their wooden chest bore the royal seal and formal language, but its meaning was simple. The farm belonged to the family that worked it, protected by law and earned through labor. The family farm legacy deed, as old Bjorn had dubbed it, represented something unprecedented in their region, a holding granted not through noble inheritance or royal favor, but through the recognition that some bonds transcended bloodlines and political convenience. Magnus emerged from the barn leading Brunhilde, now heavy with calf and requiring extra attention. At 15, the boy had grown taller and broader, his shoulders already showing the strength that came from years of meaningful work. But it was the confidence in his bearing that marked the most significant change, the quiet assurance of someone who knew his place in the world and the value of his contributions to it. Old Bjorn says the new calf will come before the week's end, Magnus called out as he led the cow to fresh pasture. And he thinks it'll be a strong one, based on how she's carrying. Good news, Torvald replied, straightening from his planting to watch his son's easy competence with the livestock. We'll need the extra milk production for what's coming. What was coming had the whole community talking. 3 more families from the northern fjords had written requesting permission to settle nearby. Word had spread quietly but persistently, of a place where people could build lives based on choice rather than birthright, where hard work and honest commitment mattered more than family names or inherited wealth. Runa paused in her seeding to study her husband's face. You're still thinking about the Eriksson family's letter, aren't you? I'm thinking about what it means, Torvald admitted. When one family makes an unconventional choice, it's a curiosity. When several families follow the same path, it becomes something larger, a movement, Magnus said, approaching with the confident stride that had replaced his earlier wariness around adult conversations. Old Bjorn calls it proof that good ideas spread like seeds on fertile ground. The boy was right, and they all knew it. The successful defense of their farm, the demonstration that love and commitment could triumph over political manipulation, had inspired others who'd grown weary of lives constrained by obligations they'd never chosen. The settlement was growing not through conquest or royal decree, but through the simple appeal of authentic existence. That evening, as they gathered around their table for the meal that had become the cornerstone of their daily routine, the conversation turned to the future they were building together. The wooden bowl that passed between them now held food grown on their own land, prepared by hands that had learned to work together through every season's challenges. The magistrate sent word today, Runa said, ladling out portions of the rich stew that had become Magnus's favorite. The Crown is considering our settlement as a model for other regions. Places where people can earn their place through contribution rather than inherit it through accident of birth. Torvald felt a moment of quiet pride mixed with wariness. Official recognition brings benefits, but it also brings attention. We'll need to be careful that growth doesn't corrupt what we've built here. That's why we document everything, Magnus said practically. The deed, the agreements with new families, the principles we've established. If it's written down clearly, it's harder for people to change it later for their own convenience. The wisdom in his words reflected not just intelligence, but the deep understanding that came from living through conflict and emerging stronger. Magnus had learned lessons about power and choice that many adults never grasped, and he applied that knowledge with the steady purpose that had become his defining characteristic. Old Bjorn arrived for his weekly visit as the sun set, bringing news from the broader region and his usual mixture of practical advice and philosophical observation. At 61 summers, he moved more slowly than before, but his mind remained sharp as winter steel. "Visitors again tomorrow," he announced, settling into his customary chair by the hearth. "The Anderson family from the Western Valleys. They've heard about what you've accomplished here and want to see if the stories are true." "What stories?" Runa asked with amusement. "That a noble son learned to farm without starving. That a widow married for love without losing her independence. That a boy gained a father without losing his own identity." Bjorn's weathered face creased into a smile. Simple stories, but apparently rare enough to be worth traveling long distances to witness. Later, as Torvald and Runa walked the boundaries of their land in the gathering twilight, a nightly ritual that had replaced his former evening rides through noble halls, they spoke quietly about the responsibility that came with their unexpected success. "Do you ever miss it?" Runa asked as they paused by the apple trees Torvald had planted to mark their first anniversary. "The certainty of your old life, even if you didn't like what that certainty represented." Torvald considered the question while studying the young trees that would provide fruit for future generations. "I miss the simplicity of not having to think about consequences beyond myself. But I wouldn't trade the complexity of caring about you and Magnus and this community for all the golden simplicity in the world, even when caring means worrying about whether we're setting a good example for the families who want to follow our path." "Especially then," he replied. "Responsibility freely chosen feels different than obligation imposed by others. It's heavier in some ways, but lighter in others." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge over the land they'd defended and the life they'd built together. The iron rings on their fingers caught the moonlight, simple metal that had proven stronger than all the golden chains that had once bound them to unwanted futures. In the distance, they could see lights in the windows of neighboring homes, each one representing a family that had chosen this different way of living. The settlement was growing, but it remained true to the principles that had made it possible, that worth was earned rather than inherited, that families were built through choice rather than accident, and that love freely given was stronger than any political alliance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors, new tests of their commitment to the community they were helping to build. But tonight, walking the boundaries of their chosen home with calloused hands intertwined, they felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they had found their true place in the world. The boy who had once been a reluctant noble heir was now a man who understood that real nobility came from the daily choice to live with honor and integrity. The woman who had once been a struggling widow was now a partner in a marriage built on mutual respect and shared purpose. And the child who had once feared losing another father figure was now a young man who knew that family bonds, forged through choice, were stronger than any accident of birth. Their story had become something larger than themselves, proof that love and commitment could triumph over the forces that sought to control human hearts for political gain. And in a world where such triumphs were rare, that proof had become a beacon for others seeking their own paths to authentic existence. The legacy they were building would outlast any noble title. Any golden treasure, any political alliance, it would live on in the families who chose love over convenience, in the communities that valued contribution over inheritance, and in the simple truth that sometimes the greatest courage comes from walking away from everything you've known to find everything you've always needed. Winter had passed. Spring had come again, and the seeds they'd planted, both in the ground and in the hearts of those who witnessed their choice, continued to grow.